today is David Alcorn, a graphic designer, design director at various firms, partner or owner of his own firm, book designer, well, manage corporate design at Merrill Lynch. But for this purpose of this interview, we'll be talking about your history being the creator of the North Face logo. So thanks for joining me.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
That, like I mentioned to you off air, it's always a challenge distilling down someone's career into only a few sentences. So I hope I did it justice, because you've had a long, successful career that is still going. We talked about some potential upcoming projects. You're still going. So I appreciate you being willing to take some time. But we're gonna take a step back. I want to understand a little bit about how you got started. When did you recognize that design was something that you were interested in?
Oh, now you're going way back. For up until I was 16 years old, had imagined that I was going to go into agriculture and be a manager of a corporate ranch and go to the University of California at Davis. In the summer of my 16th year, I happened to be on the East Coast, and I read a book by a famous advertising man called David Ogilvy, and the name of the book was Your Future in Advertising. And I read about art directors, and I thought, wow, that sounds pretty cool. Maybe I could channel my way into an advertising agency. So I had been taking art classes in high school, and then wound up going 4 years to the California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland. It's now changed its name, I guess, to the California College of Art, and graduated with a bachelor's degree in fine art in graphic design. So that led me to a first job in San Francisco at a package design firm. And we were doing primarily pharmaceutical packaging, but you have to remember the era that this was in. San Francisco was kind of the epicenter of free love, drugs, sex, drugs, and rock and roll at the time. And, a lot of great music came out of that period. The Grateful Dead actually playing for some parties at the North Face store in North Beach in San Francisco. And so I hadn't been at that job very long, and on a lunch hour, I happened to take a walk, and around the corner from my office, I saw these super graphics going up some stairways, and they were super graphics of skiers. And, this was back in a time when there really wasn't such a thing as super graphics, and anything that there were had to be painted by hand, basically. And so I just went in the door and saw a fellow and introduced myself, and it turned out that his name was Al Vincelette, and he was the Western sales rep for Head Skis. And he had actually been on the U.S. Olympic team 1960 in Squaw Valley, California. Anyway, we developed a fast friendship, and one day he said, I've got some friends that need some freelance design work. And turned out that just 2 blocks from where I was working was the North Face shop. And Hap Klopp had recently purchased the North Face stores. At the time, I think there were 3, San Francisco, Berkeley, and I think Palo Alto, from Doug Tompkins. And anyway, my friend Al said, well, they need a logo and they need signage and they need labels for products that they're going to be developing. And so Al put us together, and Hap and I had lunch a couple of times in a place called Clown Alley, which was a famous landmark hamburger place in San Francisco. And he said, all right, you got the job. But the only stipulation I have is no pine trees.
Hmm.
And the reason for that was that they really hadn't developed many products of their own yet. And so they were really selling other manufacturers' products out of these retail shops. Primarily, the biggest one at the time was probably Sierra Design. And Sierra Design had pine trees in their motif of their trademark. So that's how it started. The area was infamous from the point that Broadway, the corner where the North Face was, just off the corner, the corner was a famous strip club called the Condor with the famous stripper called Carol Doda. And that was an Italian section, North Beach. And so my office was just a few blocks away. Ultimately, when I did go into business for myself, I wound up just a couple of blocks away from the North Face shop. At the time that I developed the logo, there were, I think, 5 employees in the basement of that retail shop sewing products. So that was their humble beginnings, as it were.
Well, it's a story that I feel like I've heard variations of a similar story of, especially people who get into the outdoor industry in the early days. Mark Erickson and Jan Fletcher, I mentioned to you that I interviewed them, and
Yeah.
kind of a similar story. They came on a couple of years after this instance, right? I believe in 71 they had started.
I think they may have moved to Berkeley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Mark's story was that he was just looking for a job and wandering around that area and happened to hear the whirring of the sewing machines. And he was captivated by that sound and what was happening and people making things. And just kind of wandered in and ended up getting a job that way. Definitely a different situation for yourself, but similar in that those connections are so important, to break into the outdoor industry. Just walking in and making a friendship with someone at Head led to this moment.
Yeah, and to think that Hap, think about the time, and here was this 21-year-old designer right out of school, and Hap offering him the job that has become, an internationally known icon, and without any kind of tweaking to it in over 50 years, that's probably the thing that I'm most proud of, is that the design was strong enough that there was no attempt to alter it, revise it, update it, or whatever. That the longevity of it is what I'm proud of.
Well, when you were having these conversations, you were also still working for this pharmaceutical company, right?
Well, I was actually a design firm that did pharmaceutical clients.
Right. So you were working for them. I imagine it probably would have been easy to just blow off freelance work and say, oh, I've got enough on my plate, working 9 to 5. Do I really need to take on additional work? I guess what was your thought process there, taking on more work for a company that was largely unknown, right? You had no
Yeah,
idea that this would
right.
grow to be what it is
True.
today. Why take on one more project? What was it about this project that caught your attention?
It has to go back to Hap and his enthusiasm and um, his belief in the product and um, towards the environment. You know, people really weren't revved up about um, conservation and of the environment, and so all of those things were things that made me want to be associated with this company and continue to do whatever I could possibly do for them. Um, so, you know, I continued doing projects for them for some time, even after they moved to Berkeley, and did some vehicle graphics, and I designed a trade show booth for them, and uh, quite a number of uh, collateral material.
Right.
And as I mentioned to you, in looking back, I don't have an actual copy of the piece anymore, but in the photograph, I see that I was actually a model in one of the product photos. So, um, you know, it's not only that I've believed in the company all this time, but I've also been, um, you know, a 50-year plus customer.
Right.
Um, you know, I walk through my mudroom and every coat on the coat rack is some kind of North Face product, be it rain parkas or gloves or um, uh, you know, a lot of other things hanging on that rack, hats, etc. So I'm
When
very enthusiastic about the company, always have been, and can will continue to be.
what was that? I guess what was your process going into creating the logo for the North Face? At the time, they had a logo, right? Or some they had the North Face, a
Yeah,
word mark, right? And
yeah.
uh, what went into that, the evolution of that, and the
Well,
process of
the
creating
evolution
something?
of it, you know, I started out, as I mentioned to you, doing a bunch of thumbnail sketches on tissue paper, and I tried things like points of the compass to relate to north. Um, uh, you know, tried things with mountain shapes, uh, but I really hadn't at that age of 21. I really hadn't seen very many of the mountains of the world. Yeah, I knew that there was Whitney and um, you know, Everest, etc. And but I had never been to any of these places, but I had been to Yosemite, and in just doodling around and stacking up the type, um, I happened to just literally with an overlay, tissue overlay, bump the shape of Half Dome in Yosemite against the type. And I thought, this is it. This is going to be a very strong statement in this configuration. I tried other configurations of it in a linear form with a small logo at the end of it, and you know that just didn't make it. But the locked up position of the words "flush right" in all bold caps, Helvetica, um, with that symbol going off to the side, um, I came to the conclusion that that was it. And every piece that I put together in terms of presentation material, stationery, checks, sketches of a truck, etc., um, all had that same locked up um, logo type. And I wound up not, I was so convinced that that was it that I literally didn't present any other design directions. And they bought it. They said, this is it. This is definitely it. And I can't imagine in today's environment with huge branding firms and focus groups, et cetera, that, that this would have stood a chance. I mean, the design would have stood a chance, but the process and not showing any other candidates just really wouldn't fly today.
Well, you've been through that process on the corporate side, or been involved with Merrill Lynch. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that more down the road. But I just the connection between these symbols, right, and the brand. I don't know. Do you mind talking a little bit about that and the process that companies go through, the just the thought, the work that goes into creating a brand and a symbol that represents that brand, and how those are intertwined. Like you've kind of described, a very different process when you created
Process
this initial logo.
at first for me was I really basically just groped along till I felt like, you know, this is what they taught me. This is what my professor would have said. This is the way you present it on presentation boards, etc. But then I actually got hired by design firms and as a design director, and I would sit in meetings with corporate clients and they would say, well, this is our product. This is, what we're going to be doing, and whether it necessitated name generation for a product, and then visuals to go along with it, packaging, etc. We always had internal meetings with the design staff and would look at dozens of possible directions. And for the most part, in the firms that I've been affiliated with, we always brought it down to 3 potential designs to present to the corporate client. And that's sort of the way it went. And when I was on the Merrill Lynch side and had a few product names that we had to come up with names and logotypes for, then I was on the side deciding which one of those candidates was the most viable for us. So that's basically the logic and rationale without going into deep detail about it. But yeah, so I worked in the consulting firm side and as I mentioned at Merrill Lynch on the client side.
Right. When you were creating the North Face logo, you mentioned on the corporate side, like there's so much thought that goes into that process and what those symbols mean. Did you find yourself, as you were creating the logo and sketching, iterating on this idea, were you thinking about it to that level of, what does this brand mean? Were you looking at it from a branding perspective? It's like trying to take the values of this company and distill it into a symbol. Does that make sense?
I can't say that I was at that point. I was thinking more about applications, sleeping bags, labels, and fabric labels, and signage, and advertising, and all the iterations of where this would be applied. And so, as far as a company philosophy, I mean, their philosophy I was totally in tune with, and so I can't say that it really entered my mind anymore after that, but that the North Face was a preeminent environmental conscious company, and that I wanted to be associated with.
Right. Oh, that makes sense. That's great. Um, I think going back to a mountain that's so important to California was an interesting choice, right? And but
Well, it
like you
was
said,
being in our own backyard, if you will.
right? I just think about most outdoor companies. There's some type of tie back to nature, right? Whether that's the Patagonia range,
Yeah.
logo of Patagonia, or Bar, has a mountain peak. Not I don't know if it's any specific mountain peak.
Well, I
There's
don't
so
know
many.
that for years and years and years, um, I never had anybody ask me what the design represented.
Hmm,
And, it was probably 10 years before it dawned on anybody that, oh, I think he took this shape from Half Dome in Yosemite. And, that basically was right. But it had more to do as I was sitting at the drawing board. And in those days, you sat at a drawing board, not at a computer. And uh, with a ruling pen and ruling compass, and it had more to do with the curves off of the stacked up letter forms, and it just reminisced Half Dome in the beginning of my original thumbnail sketches.
Well, I think there's something visually that really stands out about that contrast between most of these other outdoor brands going with a jagged mountain range look.
Mhm.
There's something about that rounded out mountain it just is striking. It's so different
Mhm.
from many of the other logos from in the outdoor industry at the time. I, I I just keep going back to this idea of tying the logo back to a place, that being so significant. And so much has aged really well about the logo itself.
Mhm.
But one in particular that I think is so interesting is tying it back to that place in particular, Yosemite, and so much of the outdoor industry developing on the face of that mountain, right? Whether it's directly related to the North Face or it's other outdoor pioneers
Yeah.
gathering at that place.
Well, I
um,
I think at this point, if they were just starting out and not part of a conglomerate that's headquartered in Denver these days, presenting them with a symbol that represented a mountain in California might not have been
mhm,
one of the primary candidates.
right. I agree. And I think it's more and more looking back, um it's an incredible choice for a location just because of all of the history that has occurred in that location, and really solidifies the North Face
Yeah.
as being a part of the larger legacy of the outdoor industry, right? And a
Right.
lot of its
So,
origins being in that region.
right. And so many of the North Face sponsored athletes
Hmm.
have had fabulous experiences and things in Yosemite. So
Right.
um, I think I'm pretty proud of that fact.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that you mentioned being proud of is kind of the timelessness of the logo and how little, well, it hasn't changed, right? And how the company hasn't made any adjustments. Kind of bringing the conversation forward a little bit to present day. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Seeing, well, companies are very protective of those logos, right? We've started to see some companies take some liberties, especially with collaboration between brands being more and more popular. You'll start to see variations on iconic brands like the Nike swoosh. Um, but it's still, that's a little taboo, right? To alter a brand's logo. I'd be
No,
curious to hear your thoughts on the recent North Face Gucci collaboration. To see those two iconic brands come together in one logo must have been an interesting moment for you to see.
it was an interesting moment for me to see. It was disheartening to see so many negative comments when they posted a video on Instagram. Those are diehard, longtime North Face customers that will be difficult to persuade that their brand hasn't deserted them. But I'm all for collaborations when they work. How they're presented is something that I'm just this week starting a dialogue with the folks in Denver about how there should be some formal graphic standards agreed upon at corporate level on how to handle these kind of visual collaborations. That I believe in the feedback that I got between Christmas and New Year's regarding the Gucci promotion was one of confusion by so many people, thinking that the name of Gucci and the North Face logo coming into such close proximity to one another, they thought that a new corporate entity had been formed, where in fact it has not. So I think going forward and with some agreed upon standards, which I should have recommended years ago, but we've gone 50 years without any kind of alteration to the logo or infringement upon it. There have been certainly a lot of imitations of it, and I was in Nepal about a year ago in October, I guess, and I wasn't climbing, but we had a guide, and he said, well, here we have the North Fakes, and there are so many knockoffs of the North Face, and apparently I believe that the corporation was trying to crack down legally on people using the logo type illegally or without any kind of permission. But now I've seen, I guess, probably half a dozen or more variations on the design, and I guess you might say that imitation is the best compliment, but in these cases they weren't graphically as well done. But anyway, that's what happens when you your product is so popular and spread around the world.
Right. Well, that gets into that question of brand, right? And preserving what brand means to people. And that's where companies start cracking down on fakes and imitations because of what that negative perception can do to damage a brand. You maybe while you weren't thinking about some of these things while creating the North Face logo, I imagine as you progress through your career and then eventually working for a company like Merrill Lynch, like preserving brand has got to be top of mind for you.
Part of my job was to go after employees, divisions, et cetera, that were using it without permission from headquarters and doing all kinds of graphic iterations to it. So, I became pretty aware of the importance of graphic standards manuals. And, even those standards can change over the years when new things occur and new ways of presenting things. But, there basically is a formality and hierarchy of who's doing what. Now, in the case of North Face Gucci was placed at the bottom. So I suspect that um, the North Face had more in control over that graphic than Gucci had, where it wasn't official Gucci logo type or their graphic symbol of the two linking G's. But you know, standards are pretty much a must when you get to be that size, and some ways of formatting. Could it be the North Face for Gucci, or Gucci for the North Face? And all of those have have a visual emphasis.
These are all the battles that you don't hear
Yeah.
about, right? Over the brand and how it's represented
Yeah.
and displayed.
And if you saw the video that they put
Mm-hmm.
out, so many diehard North Face customers were appalled that there were these high fashion models out in the mountains without the boots laced up, or or wearing high heel shoes with a purse. Um, I can understand the quote campiness of high fashion models in camp, but so many people took an exception to it, that I think there needs to be a little more explanation to what the promotion was about, with as particularly in the case where so many loyal customers uh, thought that the company was abandoning them.
Mm. Yeah, it's I mean, this is everything. This is what you live and breathe, right? Is what is the perception? Like what are our decisions going to, what are those ripple effects, right?
Yeah.
How are people going to perceive us based on the decisions that we make? And even, where we place Gucci in relation to the North Face logo, right? These are the things, the nitty-gritty things that you think about in your role.
North Face for Gucci, or Gucci for the North Face. The visual balance is ever so important to people's perception of what the hierarchy should be.
Right. Well, I think the other piece that's interesting about the logo today is I think it's timeless in a lot of ways. And I don't know if that's just the visual style that you chose at that time. It's a very clean, minimal look that has stood the test of time.
Well, I was
Yep.
very influenced in my college studies by my design professor, who was a Swiss designer. And so, if people say there's a Swiss look to it, or because I used Helvetica type, I had tried, when I go back and look at those thumbnail sketches, I had tried some things with serif type, and they just weren't making it. And when I doodled around with Helvetica, I thought, this is a strong statement.
That's great. Well, I don't know, but we could do a whole second episode all about the rest of your career. I guess, where did, maybe as a way to kind of, I don't know, wrap up our conversation a little bit. I don't want to keep you too long, but you present this, it's accepted by the company, you go on and do other projects for the brand as well.
Mm-hmm.
Was that maybe this is an understatement, was that a turning point for your career?
I must say it was, and my friendship with Alvin Salette perpetuated my doing more work for the ski industry. I designed, I think it was 17 models of snow skis for Yamaha Sports at the time, and Al and I actually made 3 trips to Hamamatsu, Japan in the course of 5 weeks. And to bring the name Gucci in again, Yamaha had sent me probably 24 pairs of blank white skis. And in the beginning, it was only sketches that I was taking back and forth. But when we got down to some more finalized models of the graphics, I had to have these skis silk screened, which I did in San Francisco, and then carried 17 skis to Japan with me. And so I wound up with these blank skis. And there was a salesman around. I have to preface this, that my office was in a small building, and there were, I think, total of 8 graphic designers and commercial artists, I'll call them, illustrators, who worked for advertising agencies. But one of the guys who was selling my office mate's work always wore Gucci shoes, and he was very proud of these Gucci shoes. And so I did a Gucci design on a pair of skis and had them silk screened, and we presented this guy with the Gucci skis, which he skied on, and I'm pretty sure at Mount Rose and Squaw Valley. So that was just a little side note.
I hope he still has those.
I haven't spoken to him probably in 48 years, so I don't know that he's even alive still. But wow. Anyway, that was a Gucci aside.
Well, we haven't even gotten into I feel like the second half of your career, or what you're going to be working on, because as you said, you're still going. You still have so many more things that you plan to do. I guess what has kept design interesting to you? You've mentioned off air having to learn new tools and push yourself in that way. What excites you about this work and continuing to engage in it? Why not just take a break?
The ideas continue to flow and the methods change. There was a time when we used a brush and ink to indicate type on our mock-ups and things, and now we use computers. But it's just something new every day as far as I'm concerned, and it's exciting. Even though, well, I say right now I've been working on books for a long time. Well, some are primarily text-driven, and they can be, some people would say, boring, but how the type looks on the page, what the white space looks like around the type, where you place a figure. It's still, I'm coming up on 75 years old, and it's still all exciting to me. So it's something new every day.
How does that feel to start your career that way, almost 50 years ago, to be reconnecting with the brand now, and potentially working with them again in the future?
It's all very exciting. In fact, to step back a little, like about 3 years ago, I was contacted by some people in Tokyo involved with Condé Nast Publishers, and they were going to do a commemorative book as a gift to some of their clients on the 50th anniversary of the North Face. And they said, could we interview you? And I said, well, certainly. Do you want me to meet you in San Francisco? And they said, no, well, we'll come to you. And I said, well, I live in the mountains far from San Francisco, and that's okay. And so on a rainy night in November of 2016, I guess it was even, this minivan pulls into my driveway, and here's two editors, a photographer and an interpreter, and their driver. And they hadn't eaten, and it was pouring rain, so I made a fire and had some frozen shrimp and pasta in the fridge. So I whipped up a quick meal for them, and we opened a couple of bottles of wine, and they interviewed me, and then they went away. And I kept in contact with them, and ultimately they sent me a copy of the book, and uh, shortly thereafter, I heard from the North Face saying, geez, we're going to do, we're starting to work on some things that are based on, going back to our roots and using some of those color schemes and such. And so would you be interested in being a part of that fireside chat that I mentioned earlier with Hap Klopp and Mark Erickson talking with their design staff and others at the North Face. So it was great seeing how they are working now. When back when it was just me, it was basically just me and Hap making design decisions. And as they grew, they needed other people to work on things, and I that was in probably by mid '74. The company or the country was in quite a recession, and I was going as far away as Tokyo again to try to solicit more work from Yamaha and other sports-oriented companies, and wound up not having, I had to ultimately close my office and accepted a job as a design director for a firm in New York City. And that's how I wound up going to the East Coast. And so, one thing leads to another, and all of a sudden here I am back in touch with a lot of the people, and it's great to see Hap again. He and I have had lunch a time or two, and so we're kind of resurrecting old times, and it's a lot of fun.
Well, on kind of a slightly different note, but a similar vein, I think of all of the outdoor industry specific logos, I think your story is the one that has been talked about and documented in a way um, that I feel like is not common of a lot of the other iconic outdoor brands. I know that you're the designer of the North Face logo because I've been diving into this history. I've also tried to dig into the history of a lot of the other iconic logos out there, and their history is not so well documented. I'm surprised by that, but not surprised at the same time. But surprised because of the power of brand and the power of telling this story of the creation of a logo, which represents so much of what these brands are. Why do you think that happens? Why do you think some of these stories get lost when these symbols are so important to these companies? And maybe it's because the outdoor industry is maturing. It's a young industry that maybe didn't recognize what it had, but now wishes it had documented those stories. What are your thoughts there?
I think you're exactly right in that they wish that they had documented it at the time. But I can say that, working on brand and visual image at the time was a very small piece of Hap's, uh, you know, time of the day, and he was busy with product design and where we're going to merchandise this, where we're going to get our supplies, and so if you had talked to the North Face 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't have gotten as much information as you're able to get right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't even know these materials still existed out in my storeroom in my flat files. There's a lot there that I wish. I mean, there's a lot that's not there that I wish that that there was. But time goes by and things get misplaced or discarded, and if you're not actively trying to keep an archive, then things just kind of go away. And
Right.
It's probably the same with the oral history of some of these other brands that they just forgot to document them, or they don't have the materials to back up any new documentation. And so I'm very thankful for this opportunity to share it with you, and so that it'll be around when these people who were there in the very beginning are no longer here, including my.
Well, more and more I'm recognizing that if people don't document the history, it disappears, right?
Exactly.
I recently, this is a project that I'm working on that I haven't really talked about, but one of the outdoor industry logos that I think is really, it's not a brand, it's the KOA.
Mm-hmm.
A pretty unique logo. I was starting to dig into the history of that, and happened to find the family of the designer of that logo, and that history hasn't really been well documented. And so I'm kind of diving into that and hoping to do some oral histories with the family, and hoping to find some early print materials, early sketches. Hopefully those things are preserved, but more and more I'm recognizing the importance of this work where, if the brand doesn't preserve the story, or if, a historian doesn't come by later on and records the oral history, those things can just disappear. Right. And people won't even know that they existed. So I appreciate you being willing to help be a part of this, and appreciate you saving those napkin sketches and being able to get those back to the North Face where they can be preserved and appreciated and studied and referenced in the future. So it takes people like you who recognize, maybe not in the moment, but happen to save those things, and for a future time. So
Exactly.
well, David, I appreciate you taking time. This has been fun. I've appreciated diving in and learning a little bit more about your history.
Well, thank you.